The steady beeping of machines filled the sterile hospital room, a mechanical symphony that had become my unwanted companion for 4 long months. But what shattered my world wasn't the sound of those life-supporting devices. It was the whispered conversation I heard when I finally opened my eyes after 120 days in darkness. My name is Linda Warren. I'm 66 years old, and I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. Or rather, I lived there before my world collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. 4 months ago, I was preparing for my granddaughter Emma's 8th birthday party, the most important family gathering of the year. I had spent weeks planning every detail, from the princess-themed decorations to the 3-tier vanilla cake she'd been dreaming about. I had even bought her a $500 bicycle, painted in her favorite shade of pink, hiding it in my garage like a precious secret. But fate had other plans. On the morning of September 15th, while hanging streamers in my living room, a massive stroke struck me down like lightning from a clear sky. The last thing I remembered was reaching for Emma's birthday banner, and then nothing. Complete darkness. 4 months of nothingness, where my body lay motionless while my family made decisions about my life. Decisions I was about to discover were more sinister than I could have ever imagined. When consciousness finally returned to me on that cold January morning, it came back slowly, like dawn breaking through heavy storm clouds. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead, and every muscle in my body screamed in protest. But it was my hearing that returned first, crystal clear and devastating. "Tonight we'll turn off the machines. No one will suspect," came the whispered voice of my son, Daniel Warren, 37 years old. The boy I had raised with every ounce of love in my heart, the man I had sacrificed everything for. His voice carried a coldness that froze my blood more than any winter morning ever could. My 34-year-old daughter-in-law, Sophie, responded with a tone so casual it made my soul shudder. "Finally, the inheritance papers are already prepared. We just need to wait a few hours after, make it look natural." My hands began to tremble uncontrollably, but I was still too weak to move, too fragile to scream, too broken to fight. The irony was crushing. I had awakened only to discover that those closest to me wanted me dead. The very people I had poured my life savings into, the ones I had given $75,000 to help buy their dream house just 2 years ago, were now planning my murder with the casual indifference of discussing the weather. When Daniel and Sophie finally left my room, their footsteps echoing like death knells in the corridor, I lay there drowning in a sea of betrayal and disbelief. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, each sound now feeling like a countdown to my planned execution. But then, like an angel appearing in my darkest hour, Nurse Patricia Williams entered my room. She was a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She approached my bed with gentle steps, looked directly into my eyes that I'm sure reflected all the terror and anguish consuming my soul, and whispered words that became my lifeline. "Stay calm. I heard everything." In that moment, I realized that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. This stranger, this nurse who owed me nothing, had just become my guardian angel in a world where my own blood had turned against me. The irony was devastating. A woman I had known for mere moments cared more about my life than the son I had raised for 37 years. As Nurse Patricia squeezed my hand gently, I felt a spark of hope ignite in my chest. Yes, I was weak. Yes, I was vulnerable. But I was alive, and now I had an ally. The war for my life was about to begin, and I wasn't going down without a fight. If you're watching this story unfold and want to know how I survived this nightmare, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Knowing that people around the world are listening gives me strength to continue sharing my truth. The hours that followed Nurse Patricia's revelation felt like an eternity suspended between life and death. As she sat beside my bed during her night shift, she explained in hushed tones how she had witnessed Daniel and Sophie's previous conversations over the past weeks, conversations that painted a horrifying picture of premeditated murder disguised as mercy. "Mrs. Warren," Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming machines. "They've been coming here every night for the past 2 weeks, discussing your condition with the doctors. Your son has been pushing for a DNR order. Do not resuscitate, claiming it's what you would have wanted. My heart felt like it was being crushed in a vice. The DNR order meant that if my condition worsened, the medical staff wouldn't attempt to save me. It was a death sentence wrapped in legal paperwork, and Daniel was orchestrating it with the precision of a seasoned killer. Patricia continued, her eyes scanning the door nervously. But here's what they don't know. I've been recording their conversations on my phone. Not legally admissible in court, but enough to build a case. Your son mentioned something about your will, about properties worth over $200,000, and a life insurance policy worth $150,000. The numbers hit me like physical blows. The properties Patricia mentioned were my life's work, the small rental house I had inherited from my mother and had spent decades maintaining, plus my own home where I had raised Daniel after his father died when he was just 12. The life insurance policy was something I had purchased years ago, intended to secure Daniel's future, never imagining it would become the motive for my murder. There's more, Patricia said, her voice growing more urgent. Sophie has been telling people you've been in a vegetative state for months, that there's no hope for recovery. She's been building a narrative to justify what they're planning to do. As Patricia spoke, fragments of memories began flooding back. Daniel's wife Sophie had never liked me. That much was clear from the beginning of their marriage 3 years ago. She came from money, a privileged background that made her look down on my modest lifestyle. I remembered how she would roll her eyes when I insisted on cooking Sunday dinners for the family, how she would make snide comments about my outdated furniture and small house. But I had tried so hard to win her over. When they struggled to buy their first home, I didn't hesitate to withdraw $75,000 from my retirement savings, money I had earned through 40 years of working double shifts as a seamstress in Cincinnati's garment district. My fingers still bore the scars from countless pinpricks and cuts from fabric scissors, each mark a testament to the sacrifices I had made for my family. We need to be strategic, Patricia continued. Tomorrow morning, Dr. Rodriguez will be making his rounds. He's the chief neurologist, and he's a good man. If we can get you to show clear signs of consciousness when he's here, we can stop whatever Daniel is planning. The challenge seemed insurmountable. My body felt like it belonged to someone else. Every movement required tremendous effort, and speaking was nearly impossible. But Patricia had a plan. She would help me practice small movements throughout the night, preparing for the crucial moment when Dr. Rodriguez would examine me. Your son scheduled a meeting with Dr. Rodriguez for tomorrow at 2 p.m., Patricia revealed. He's bringing legal documents, probably the DNR order. We have less than 18 hours to prove you're conscious and aware. As Patricia helped me practice squeezing her hand and blinking in response to questions, I thought about Emma, my precious granddaughter. Was she wondering where Grandma Linda was? Did Daniel tell her I was dying? The thought of never seeing her sweet smile again, never hearing her call me Grandma Linny in her sing-song voice, filled me with a determination that transcended my physical weakness. Patricia checked her watch. It was nearly midnight. Mrs. Warren, I need you to understand something. If we succeed tomorrow, this is just the beginning. Daniel and Sophie won't give up easily. They've already invested too much in this plan. But I promise you this, I won't let them hurt you. I've seen too many families torn apart by greed, and I won't stand by and watch it happen again. Her words carried the weight of personal experience, and I wondered what tragedy in her own life had made her so determined to protect me. Whatever her reasons, I was grateful beyond words. In this sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines and uncertainty, this near stranger had become my strongest ally. As the night wore on, Patricia continued helping me regain small motor functions while sharing more details about Daniel and Sophie's conversations. They had discussed selling my house immediately after my death, splitting the life insurance money, and even mentioned how they would comfort little Emma through her grandmother's peaceful passing. The manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty. They weren't just planning to kill me. They were crafting an elaborate story that would make them look like grieving family members making difficult but necessary decisions. Sophie had even researched grief counselors for Emma, adding another layer to their deceptive facade. But as dawn approached and Patricia prepared to end her shift, I felt something stirring within me that I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Tomorrow would be the first battle in what I suspected would be a long war. But I was ready to fight for my life, my legacy, and most importantly, for the truth that my son and his wife were trying to bury along with me. Doctor. Michael Rodriguez entered my room at exactly 1:47 p.m., 13 minutes before my son's scheduled meeting. Patricia had timed it perfectly. She knew the doctor's routines better than anyone. As he approached my bed with his clipboard and stethoscope, I felt my heart racing with anticipation and terror. This was my moment, perhaps my only chance to save my own life. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Warren," Dr. Rodriguez said in his warm, professional voice. He was a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and intelligent brown eyes that had seen countless medical miracles and tragedies. "I'm going to perform a standard neurological assessment." Patricia stood nearby, positioning herself where she could catch my eye. We had rehearsed this moment all night, practicing the signals that would prove my consciousness. As Dr. Rodriguez began his examination, checking my pupils with a small flashlight, I summoned every ounce of strength in my weakened body. "Mrs. Warren, if you can hear me, try to squeeze my hand," he said, taking my right hand in his. With tremendous effort, I managed a weak but unmistakable squeeze. Dr. Rodriguez paused, his eyebrows raising slightly. He repeated the test twice more, and each time I responded. I could see the surprise and excitement growing in his expression. "Mrs. Warren, if you understand what I'm saying, blink twice for yes and once for no." 2 deliberate blinks. The moment felt like a victory march. Dr. Rodriguez immediately began a more comprehensive assessment, testing my responses to various stimuli. With each successful response, I could see his medical excitement building. After 45 minutes of testing, he stepped back with a look of amazement. "This is remarkable," he said to Patricia. "Mrs. Warren is showing clear signs of consciousness and cognitive function. Her responses are consistent and appropriate. This isn't a vegetative state. This is a woman who is very much aware of her surroundings." Just then, Daniel walked into the room, carrying a leather briefcase that I knew contained the documents that would have sealed my fate. He was dressed in his best suit, navy blue with a red tie, the same outfit he had worn to his father's funeral years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Dr. Rodriguez," Daniel said with practiced concern, "I'm here to discuss my mother's condition and the paperwork we discussed." "Actually, Mr. Warren, we need to have a very different conversation," Dr. Rodriguez replied, his tone becoming more serious. "Your mother has just demonstrated clear neurological responses. She's conscious, aware, and responding to stimuli. There's been a significant improvement in her condition." I watched Daniel's face transform from fake concern to genuine shock, then to something that looked like anger. Sophie appeared in the doorway moments later, her designer purse clutched tightly in her manicured hands. "That's impossible," Sophie said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "She's been unresponsive for months. The other doctor said there was no hope." Dr. Rodriguez consulted his chart. "I've reviewed all previous assessments, and it appears there may have been some misinterpretation of her neurological status. Mrs. Warren is showing signs of what we call locked-in syndrome recovery. She may have been conscious for some time, but unable to communicate effectively." The implications of his words hung in the air like a thundercloud. If I had been conscious, it meant I could have heard conversations, witnessed interactions, and formed memories during my supposed comatose state. Daniel's face had gone pale, and Sophie was gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles were white. "Doctor, perhaps we should discuss the DNR order anyway," Daniel said, his voice strained. "My mother is 66 years old, and the quality of life concerns." "Mr. Warren," Dr. Rodriguez interrupted firmly, "I cannot and will not consider a DNR order for a patient who is demonstrating clear cognitive function and recovery potential. In fact, I'm recommending we begin aggressive rehabilitation therapy immediately." I wanted to scream with joy, but instead managed to squeeze Dr. Rodriguez's hand again when he asked if I was in pain. One squeeze for no, I was not in pain. I was experiencing the opposite of pain. I was feeling hope surge through my veins like life-giving medicine. Patricia stepped forward. "Doctor, I think you should know that Mrs. Warren's family has been discussing her condition extensively. Perhaps they should be involved in understanding her actual medical status rather than making assumptions." Her words were carefully chosen, but I could hear the underlying warning. Daniel caught it too. His jaw clenched, and I saw a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. "Of course," Daniel said through gritted teeth. "We just want what's best for Mother." Sophie moved closer to Daniel, and I watched them exchange a look that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. If anything, Dr. Rodriguez's discovery had just made me more dangerous to their plans. A conscious Linda Warren was a threat to everything they had orchestrated. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on your progress, Mrs. Warren," Dr. Rodriguez said, patting my hand gently. "And I'll be consulting with the rehabilitation team about beginning physical therapy within the week." As the doctor left, Daniel and Sophie remained in my room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the steady beeping of the machines that they had planned to disconnect that very evening. "Well, Mother," Daniel said finally, his voice dripping with false cheerfulness, "isn't this wonderful news? You're going to recover." But his eyes told a different story. They burned with frustration and something else, determination. I realized with growing horror that Dr. Rodriguez's discovery hadn't saved me. It had simply forced Daniel and Sophie to revise their plans. As they prepared to leave, Sophie leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Enjoy your little victory, Linda. But accidents happen in hospitals all the time, especially to elderly patients who are just learning to walk again." Her threat was clear, and as they walked out of my room, I knew the real danger was just beginning. They had $350,000 worth of reasons to see me dead, and my newfound consciousness had just made me an even bigger target. But I also knew something they didn't. I had an ally in Patricia, and I had just proven that I was much stronger than anyone had imagined. The war for my life had begun, and I was ready to fight. 3 days after Dr. Rodriguez's discovery, I had regained enough strength to whisper short sentences and move my arms with increasing coordination. The physical therapy sessions were exhausting, but exhilarating. Each small movement felt like a victory against the darkness that had claimed 4 months of my life. But my recovery also meant that Daniel and Sophie were becoming increasingly desperate. Patricia had been documenting everything in a small notebook she kept hidden in her uniform pocket. She showed me pages of timestamps, conversation summaries, and suspicious incidents that had occurred since my awakening. The pattern was becoming clear and terrifying. "They've been asking questions about the night shift schedules," Patricia whispered during her rounds. "Sophie specifically wanted to know which nurses would be working when you're alone. She's also been researching medication interactions. I found search history on the family computer when I visited their house under the pretense of updating them on your condition." The revelation that Patricia had taken such risks to protect me left me speechless. This woman, who earned a modest $45,000 per year caring for patients like me, was putting her career and possibly her safety on the line for someone she had known for less than a week. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice still weak but growing stronger daily. "Why are you helping me?" Patricia's eyes filled with tears as she sat beside my bed. "Because 15 years ago, my own mother died in a hospital under suspicious circumstances. My stepfather convinced the doctors she was suffering that keeping her alive was cruel. I was young and believed him. I found out later he had been having an affair and wanted her life insurance money. By the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. I swore I would never let that happen to another family." Her confession explained everything: the determination in her voice, the risks she was willing to take, the way she seemed to anticipate Daniel and Sophie's every move. This wasn't just about me. This was about justice for her mother and countless other victims of family greed disguised as mercy. That evening, as Patricia began her night shift, she brought disturbing news. "Daniel hired a private nurse for tonight, someone named Margaret Collins. She's not part of our regular staff, and she specifically requested to work your room during the overnight hours." My blood ran cold. A stranger with access to my medications, my IV lines, my life support systems. It was the perfect setup for an accidental death that would appear natural and inevitable. "What can we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. Patricia's expression hardened with resolve. "We're going to set a trap. I've already spoken with Dr. Rodriguez and head nurse Jennifer Martinez. They're aware of the suspicious circumstances surrounding your case. Tonight, I'll be monitoring from the next room, and we've set up a hidden camera to record everything that happens." As darkness fell over the hospital, I felt like a lamb waiting for slaughter. Margaret Collins arrived at 11 p.m., a thin woman in her 50s with cold gray eyes and an efficient, emotionless demeanor. She introduced herself with professional courtesy, but there was something unsettling about the way she examined my IV setup and checked my medication chart. "Mrs. "Warren," she said in a voice devoid of warmth, "I'll be taking care of you tonight. Your son and daughter-in-law have asked me to ensure you're as comfortable as possible." The emphasis she placed on comfortable sent chills down my spine. I pretended to be drowsier than I actually was, letting my eyes flutter closed while remaining hyper-aware of every sound and movement in the room. Around 1 a.m., Margaret began preparing a syringe with a clear liquid. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched her through barely opened eyelids. She moved with practiced efficiency, drawing the substance from a small vial she had brought in her personal bag. Definitely not standard hospital medication. "This will help you sleep peacefully, Mrs. Warren," she murmured, approaching my IV line. Just as the needle touched the port, Patricia burst through the door with Dr. Rodriguez and 2 security guards right behind her. "Stop right there," Patricia commanded, her voice ringing with authority. Margaret froze, the syringe still in her hand. "I'm just administering the prescribed sleep medication," she said, but her voice wavered with obvious guilt. Dr. Rodriguez immediately took the syringe and examined the vial. "This isn't prescribed medication. This is a concentrated dose of morphine, enough to cause respiratory failure in a patient of Mrs. Warren's condition." Security restrained Margaret as she began protesting her innocence, claiming she had been given specific instructions by the family. But the hidden camera had captured everything, including her preparation of the unauthorized medication and her obvious intent to administer a lethal dose. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, Dr. Rodriguez turned to me with concern and admiration. "Mrs. Warren, you've just survived a murder attempt. We need to contact the police immediately." Patricia squeezed my hand as tears of relief and anger streamed down my face. "It's over, Linda. We got them." But even as I felt the overwhelming relief of survival, I knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Daniel and Sophie had just shown they were willing to hire professional killers to secure their inheritance. They had paid Margaret Collins $10,000. I learned this when police searched her belongings and found the cash payment, along with detailed instructions about medication dosages and timing. The irony was devastating. Daniel had spent $10,000 trying to kill me to inherit $350,000. The cold calculation behind the numbers revealed just how completely greed had consumed my son's heart. As police officers took my statement in the early morning hours, I realized that my fight for survival had evolved into something much larger. A fight for justice, not just for me, but for Patricia's mother, for Margaret's potential future victims, and for every elderly person who had ever been betrayed by those they trusted most. Dawn was breaking over Cincinnati, and for the first time in months, I was truly awake to see it. But the sunrise also revealed the harsh reality ahead. My own son was willing to kill me for money, and our family would never be the same again. Within 48 hours of Margaret Collins' arrest, my hospital room had transformed into a war room. Detective Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed investigator in her early 40s, had taken over the case with the intensity of someone who had seen too many families destroyed by greed. She sat beside my bed with stacks of files, recording equipment, and a determination that matched Patricia's protective instincts. "Mrs. Warren, what we've uncovered goes far beyond a simple murder-for-hire scheme," Detective Chen explained, opening a thick manila folder. "Margaret Collins was just the beginning. Your son and daughter-in-law have been planning this for over 6 months. The evidence was staggering. Daniel's computer history revealed months of research into natural causes of death in coma patients, legal requirements for inheritance, and undetectable methods of euthanasia. Sophie had been corresponding with Margaret Collins since November, discussing payment arrangements and timing. But the most shocking discovery was financial. "Mrs. Warren, did you know that Daniel and Sophie have been living off loans secured against your properties for the past year?" Detective Chen asked gently. My world tilted on its axis. "What do you mean?" "They used forged documents showing power of attorney to take out a $95,000 home equity loan against your house. They've also been collecting rent from your investment property, approximately $1,200 per month, telling tenants that you had designated them as property managers due to your illness." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical pain I had endured. For 12 months before my stroke, while I had been babysitting Emma and cooking Sunday dinners, Daniel and Sophie had been systematically stealing from me. They hadn't just planned my murder. They had been robbing me blind while pretending to love me. The total amount they've stolen comes to approximately $109,400, Detective Chen continued. But here's where it gets complicated. They've spent most of it on luxury purchases and gambling debts. Sophie has been frequenting the casino boat at Rising Star, and Daniel has been day trading with your money. They've lost almost everything. The picture became horrifyingly clear. My death wasn't just about greed, it was about desperation. They had stolen my money, lost it through poor decisions and addictions, and needed my life insurance and property sales to cover their tracks. My murder would have solved all their financial problems while making them appear as grieving beneficiaries. We're pressing charges for attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy, Detective Chen said. But I need your help to build the strongest possible case. Are you willing to testify? Despite my physical weakness, I felt a surge of determination that surprised everyone in the room. Detective Chen, I've spent 66 years building a life, raising a family, and trying to leave something meaningful behind. If my son thinks he can steal that legacy and murder me for money, he's about to learn just how wrong he is. Patricia, who had remained my constant guardian throughout the investigation, smiled with pride. That's the fighting spirit that's going to see you through this, Linda. Over the next several days, as my physical therapy intensified and my strength returned, I learned more devastating details about Daniel and Sophie's deception. They had told Emma that Grandma Linda was very sick and might go to heaven soon, preparing her for my planned death. They had already contacted a real estate agent about selling my house, claiming I had decided to move to a retirement facility. They had even started cleaning out my belongings, keeping valuable items and donating things they considered worthless, including photo albums containing irreplaceable family memories dating back 3 generations. The financial reconstruction painted an even darker picture. Over 18 months, Daniel and Sophie had accumulated $78,000 in credit card debt, lost $31,000 in casino gambling, and blown another $45,000 on day trading with my stolen money. They were drowning in debt while maintaining a facade of middle-class respectability, driving luxury cars and wearing designer clothes purchased with money they had stolen from their supposedly beloved family member. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a recording Patricia had made of a conversation between Daniel and Sophie just days before Margaret Collins's attempted murder. In it, Sophie laughed about how the old woman had always been gullible, and Daniel joked about how much easier their lives would be without her constant interference and outdated opinions. They had reduced me to a financial inconvenience, an obstacle to their preferred lifestyle. The woman who had sacrificed her retirement savings to help them buy a house, who had worked double shifts for decades to provide for Daniel after his father's death, who had lovingly cared for their daughter every weekend, I had become nothing more than a source of money to be harvested through murder. As Detective Chen prepared the case for prosecution, she warned me about the challenges ahead. Mrs. Warren, your son and daughter-in-law have hired expensive attorneys, ironically using money they stole from you to pay legal fees. They're going to argue that you're elderly, confused, and misremembering events. They'll claim that Margaret Collins was a rogue nurse acting independently, and that they had no knowledge of her plans. What do we need to prove their guilt? I asked, my voice growing stronger with each passing day. We have the recordings, the financial evidence, and Margaret Collins' testimony. She's agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. But most importantly, we have you. Your survival and your testimony are the keys to ensuring justice. As I looked around my hospital room, at Patricia checking my vital signs, at Detective Chen organizing evidence files, at Dr. Rodriguez reviewing my recovery progress, I realized that my near-death experience had revealed something profound about human nature. In my darkest hour, strangers had risked everything to save me, while my own blood had plotted my destruction. But I was alive, I was recovering, and I was ready to fight for justice. Daniel and Sophie had underestimated the woman they tried to kill, and they were about to discover that surviving their murder attempt was just the beginning of their nightmare. 6 weeks after Margaret Collins' arrest, I walked into the Hamilton County Courthouse, using a walker, but moving under my own power. The physical therapy had been grueling, but determination fueled every painful step. Detective Chen had warned me that this preliminary hearing would be emotionally devastating, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight of Daniel and Sophie sitting at the defendant's table in expensive suits, whispering confidently with their high-priced legal team. Daniel looked exactly like his father had at that age, the same strong jawline, the same intelligent eyes that I had once found so endearing. But seeing him now, knowing what he had planned for me, those familiar features felt like a cruel mockery of the man I had loved and the son I had raised. Prosecutor Jennifer Hayes, a formidable woman in her 50s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, had spent weeks preparing me for this moment. She approached the witness stand with a stack of evidence that represented months of investigation and the systematic unraveling of Daniel and Sophie's carefully constructed lies. "Mrs. Warren," Prosecutor Hayes began, "please tell the court about your relationship with your son before your stroke." I took a deep breath, my voice carrying across the silent courtroom. I loved Daniel more than life itself. After his father died when he was 12, I worked 2 jobs to support us. I sacrificed my social life, my retirement savings, and my own comfort to ensure he had every opportunity. When he married Sophie, I welcomed her as the daughter I never had. I gave them $75,000 for their house down payment, money I had earned through 40 years of working in Cincinnati's garment district. As I spoke, I watched Daniel's face. There was no remorse, no recognition of the sacrifices I had made. Instead, he stared ahead with cold detachment, as if I were a stranger recounting someone else's story. Prosecutor Hayes continued, "Can you describe what you overheard when you first regained consciousness?" "I heard my son tell Sophie, 'Tonight we'll turn off the machines. No one will suspect.' Sophie responded by mentioning inheritance papers that were already prepared. They discussed my death with the casual indifference of people planning a grocery shopping trip. The defense attorney, a slick man named Robert Fitzgerald, who charged $500 per hour, objected repeatedly, claiming my testimony was unreliable due to my medical condition. But Dr. Rodriguez's expert testimony about my cognitive function during recovery dismantled those arguments systematically. The financial evidence was even more damning. Forensic accountant Maria Santos presented a detailed analysis of Daniel and Sophie's theft that left the courtroom stunned. They had forged my signature on loan documents, stolen $194,400 over 18 months, and used my identity to open credit accounts that they never intended to pay. "Your Honor," Maria Santos testified, "the defendants didn't just steal money. They systematically dismantled Mrs. Warren's financial security while planning her murder to cover their tracks. They spent her money on gambling, luxury purchases, and risky investments, then decided murder was easier than accountability." But the most devastating testimony came from Margaret Collins herself. The professional killer they had hired appeared in orange prison clothing, her gray hair pulled back severely, looking nothing like the confident woman who had tried to inject poison into my IV. "Daniel Warren contacted me through an online forum in December," Margaret testified, her voice flat and emotionless. "He said his mother was suffering and that ending her life would be merciful. He paid me $10,000 up front and promised another $15,000 after the job was completed." Sophie Warren provided detailed information about the hospital layout, shift schedules, and Mrs. Warren's medical requirements. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Daniel and Sophie had planned my murder with the thoroughness of a military operation, researching every detail to ensure success while maintaining plausible deniability. Margaret's testimony revealed even more horrifying details. They wanted it to look like natural complications from the stroke. The morphine overdose would have caused respiratory failure, which is common in elderly patients recovering from major medical events. They had researched which medications would be undetectable in a standard autopsy. Defense attorney Fitzgerald tried to discredit Margaret's testimony, suggesting she was lying to reduce her own sentence. But the evidence was overwhelming. Recorded phone calls, financial transactions, detailed emails discussing timing and methodology. When Prosecutor Hayes called me back to the stand for cross-examination, she asked the question that had been haunting me for weeks. "Mrs. Warren, if your son had succeeded in killing you, what would you have lost?" The question unleashed an emotional flood that I hadn't expected. I would have lost the chance to see my granddaughter Emma grow up, to teach her the family recipes that have been passed down for generations, to tell her stories about her grandfather and the family history that defines who we are. I would have lost the opportunity to see Daniel become the man I always believed he could be, to help him understand that money can never replace the love and sacrifice that built our family. My voice broke as I continued, But most importantly, I would have lost my life to people who never valued it. They saw me as a bank account with an inconvenient heartbeat, a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Several jurors were wiping away tears, and even the bailiff looked emotionally affected. But Daniel and Sophie remained unmoved, their faces masks of cold calculation. As the hearing concluded, Judge Margaret Foster set bail at $500,000 each, money that Daniel and Sophie couldn't possibly raise after spending their stolen funds. They would remain in jail pending trial, which was scheduled for 3 months later. Walking out of the courthouse that day, supported by Patricia and Detective Chen, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice was being served, but at the cost of my family's destruction. Emma would grow up knowing her father was a would-be murderer, and I would spend my remaining years knowing that my own son had valued money more than my life. But I was alive, I was healing, and I was determined to see this fight through to the end. Daniel and Sophie had underestimated the woman they tried to kill, and they were about to learn that surviving their murder attempt was just the beginning of the consequences they would face. The story broke on Cincinnati's Channel 9 News 3 days after the preliminary hearing, and within 24 hours, it had exploded into a national sensation. "Son hires hitman to kill mother for inheritance," read the headline that flashed across screens from Ohio to California. My quiet life had become a public spectacle, but surprisingly, the media attention brought unexpected allies and shocking revelations. Nancy Wilson, an investigative reporter with 20 years of experience covering family crimes, knocked on my hospital room door carrying a briefcase full of documents that would change everything. She was a woman in her late 40s with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that had seen too many tragedies caused by greed. "Mrs. Warren," Nancy said, settling into the chair beside my bed, "your story has resonated with families across the country. But more importantly, it's brought forward other victims who have experienced similar situations." She opened her briefcase and spread out a collection of files, photographs, and testimonies. "In the past 72 hours, I've received calls from 17 families who believe their elderly relatives died under suspicious circumstances involving greedy family members. Your case has given them the courage to speak out." The scope of the problem was staggering. Nancy showed me case after case of elderly victims: a 73-year-old man in Florida whose nephew had accelerated his death for a $200,000 life insurance policy, an 81-year-old woman in Texas whose granddaughter had poisoned her for control of a family ranch worth $500,000, a 69-year-old man in Oregon whose stepchildren had manipulated medical decisions to inherit his retirement savings of $180,000. "Elder abuse for financial gain is becoming an epidemic," Nancy explained. "Adult children are drowning in debt from college loans, mortgages, and lifestyle expenses. Some see their aging parents as financial solutions rather than family members deserving respect and care." But Nancy's most shocking revelation was yet to come. "Mrs. Warren, Margaret Collins wasn't working alone. We've discovered she's part of a network of nurses, aides, and medical professionals who specialize in what they call mercy killings for money. Your son and daughter-in-law found her through a dark web forum called Final Solutions." The investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise that operated across multiple states, targeting elderly patients in hospitals and nursing homes. Margaret Collins had been involved in at least 12 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years, earning between $8,000 and $25,000 per case, depending on the complexity and the family's ability to pay. "The FBI is now involved," Nancy continued. "Your survival didn't just save your life. It exposed a national network of hired killers who prey on families willing to murder for money." As Nancy's investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged about Daniel and Sophie's finances. They hadn't just stolen from me. They had been systematically defrauding multiple sources. Sophie had been embezzling $500 per month from her employer, a small accounting firm where she managed client accounts. Daniel had taken out loans using forged employment documents, claiming he earned $85,000 per year when his actual salary was $42,000. Their desperation had reached levels that made my murder seem like their only viable option. They owed $23,000 to credit card companies, $31,000 to various loan sharks and gambling establishments, and faced immediate foreclosure on the house they had purchased with my stolen money. But the media attention also brought positive developments. The hospital administration, embarrassed by the security breach that had allowed Margaret Collins access to patients, announced a $50,000 reward fund for Patricia Williams, recognizing her heroic actions in saving my life. Additionally, they implemented new security protocols to prevent similar incidents. More importantly, families began reaching out with support and encouragement. I received hundreds of letters from children who had elderly parents expressing outrage at Daniel and Sophie's actions and vowing to protect their own family members. Some letters included donations to help cover my medical expenses, even though insurance was handling most costs. One letter particularly moved me. It came from a 45-year-old woman named Carol Martinez in Denver, whose father had died under suspicious circumstances 3 years earlier. "Mrs. Warren," she wrote, "my father's death seemed natural at the time, but after hearing your story, I realize my stepmother may have been involved. You've given me the courage to reopen his case. Your survival is helping other families find justice." Patricia, who had become something of a local hero, was featured in nursing magazines as an example of professional integrity and patient advocacy. She received job offers from hospitals across the country, along with opportunities to speak at medical conferences about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. "Linda," Patricia said during one of her visits, "your story is saving lives beyond your own. Medical professionals are being trained to watch for the warning signs we missed initially. Families are having conversations about inheritance and end-of-life decisions before crisis situations arise." Dr. A. Rodriguez, meanwhile, had begun collaborating with geriatric specialists to develop protocols for identifying patients who might be victims of family-perpetrated abuse. Mrs. Warren's case taught us that medical professionals need to be more aware of financial motives behind family medical decisions, he explained to the media. As I grew stronger physically and emotionally, I realized that my near-death experience had evolved into something much larger than personal survival. It had become a catalyst for systemic change in how society protects vulnerable elderly people from their own families. The irony wasn't lost on me. Daniel and Sophie's greed had backfired spectacularly. Instead of quietly inheriting my money and disappearing into comfortable anonymity, their murder attempt had made them the faces of a national conversation about elder abuse. They were now infamous criminals whose names would be associated with betrayal and attempted murder for decades to come. But more importantly, their failed plan had given voice to countless other victims and families who had suffered in silence. My survival was becoming a beacon of hope for others who felt helpless against family members who valued money more than love. As I prepared for the trial that would determine Daniel and Sophie's fate, I knew that the verdict would send a message far beyond our family. It would tell the world whether society would tolerate adult children murdering their parents for inheritance money, or whether justice would protect the most vulnerable members of our families. The trial began on a crisp October morning, 8 months after Daniel and Sophie's arrest. Hamilton County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. News vans lined the streets, protesters carrying signs reading, "Protect Our Elders," and "Justice for Linda," filled the sidewalks, and security was tighter than during high-profile terrorism cases. I entered the courthouse walking independently for the first time since my stroke, wearing the navy blue dress that Patricia had helped me choose. At 66 years old, having survived a stroke, 4 months in a coma, and a murder attempt, I felt stronger than I had in years. The physical therapy, the emotional support from strangers nationwide, and the determination to see justice served had transformed me into a warrior. Judge Margaret Foster, a stern woman with 30 years of judicial experience, presided over what media had dubbed the trial of the century. The jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67, including several people with elderly parents and grandparents who understood the sacred trust between generations. Prosecutor Jennifer Hayes opened with a statement that silenced the packed courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about the ultimate betrayal, a son and daughter-in-law who decided that money was more valuable than the life of the woman who had sacrificed everything for their happiness. Linda Warren didn't just survive an attempted murder. She survived the calculated destruction of everything a mother's love represents. The evidence presented over the first week was overwhelming. FBI forensic accountants had traced every dollar of the $109,500 Daniel and Sophie had stolen from me. The money trail painted a picture of systematic theft combined with reckless spending that bordered on pathological. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who had led the FBI's investigation into the Mercy Killing Network, testified about the scope of their criminal enterprise. We've identified 43 suspicious deaths across 17 states, all connected to this network of hired killers who target elderly patients for money. Mrs. Warren's survival exposed what we believe is the largest elder abuse conspiracy in American history. But the most devastating testimony came from digital forensics expert Dr. James Chen, who had recovered deleted files from Daniel and Sophie's computers. The recovered data revealed the depth of their planning and the callousness of their attitudes toward my life. On September 10th, 5 days before Mrs. Warren's stroke, Daniel Warren searched for how long do coma patients usually live and average inheritance tax rates in Ohio, Dr. Chen testified. Sophie Warren researched signs of natural death in elderly patients and how to contest a will if family members object. The timeline revealed that they had been planning my death even before my stroke occurred. The medical emergency that had left me vulnerable was an opportunity they had been preparing to exploit for months. Dr. Chen continued, "We also recovered deleted text messages between the defendants. On December 3rd, Sophie Warren texted her husband, 'The old bitch has been unconscious for 3 months. Time to finish this.' Daniel responded, 'Margaret says she can make it look natural. 25 grand is cheap for 350 in insurance money.' The courtroom gasped audibly at the callous language my own family had used to discuss my murder. I felt Patricia squeeze my hand as tears streamed down my face, not from sadness, but from rage at being reduced to such dehumanizing terms by people I had loved unconditionally. Defense attorney Robert Fitzgerald attempted to portray Daniel and Sophie as loving family members who had been manipulated by Margaret Collins. My clients were grieving, desperate people who believed their beloved mother and mother-in-law was suffering. They never intended for Mrs. Warren to be harmed. They were simply seeking consultation about end-of-life options. But Prosecutor Hayes systematically demolished this narrative with evidence of their theft, their gambling addictions, their financial desperation, and their detailed planning of my murder. She presented recordings of conversations where Daniel and Sophie laughed about my condition and discussed how quickly they could access my money after my death. The most emotionally devastating moment came when prosecutors played a recording Margaret Collins had made of her final conversation with Sophie about timing my murder. In the recording, Sophie could be heard saying, "Make sure she doesn't wake up again. The longer this drags on, the more expensive it becomes. We need that insurance money before the credit card companies start garnishing Daniel's wages." The callous indifference in Sophie's voice, as she discussed my death like a financial transaction, left the jury visibly shaken. Several jurors were wiping away tears, and even the court reporter had to pause to compose herself. When I took the witness stand for my final testimony, the courtroom was silent, except for the gentle humming of the ventilation system. Prosecutor Hayes asked me to describe the impact of my son's betrayal on my life and family. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and strong, "Daniel didn't just try to kill my body. He murdered the family we had built together. He destroyed the trust that took 37 years to create. He stole not just my money, but my peace of mind, my faith in family bonds, and my granddaughter's innocence." I turned to look directly at Daniel, who had avoided making eye contact throughout the trial. "I worked 60-hour weeks for decades to give you opportunities I never had. I sacrificed my own comfort, my own dreams, my own financial security to ensure you could build a better life, and you repaid that love by hiring someone to kill me for money." The emotion in my voice carried across the silent courtroom. "But the saddest part isn't what you did to me. It's what you did to Emma. She will grow up knowing her father is a murderer, that he valued money more than her grandmother's life. You didn't just try to kill me, Daniel. You killed her childhood innocence and her ability to trust the people who are supposed to protect her. When I finished my testimony, the courtroom remained silent for several long moments. Judge Foster had to use her gavel to restore order, as spectators began whispering emotionally among themselves. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with testimony from 47 witnesses, presentation of over 200 pieces of evidence, and expert analysis that painted a comprehensive picture of premeditated murder motivated by greed and desperation. As closing arguments concluded and the jury began deliberations, I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Patricia, Detective Chen, and Nancy Wilson, the women who had become my chosen family through this ordeal. "Whatever the verdict," I told them, "you've already given me something more valuable than money. You've shown me that love and loyalty can come from unexpected places, and that justice is possible even when family fails." The jury would deliberate for 6 hours before returning with a verdict that would determine not just Daniel and Sophie's fate, but whether society would send a clear message about protecting the elderly from family predators who view inheritance as justification for murder. After 6 hours and 23 minutes of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom with expressions that revealed nothing about their decision. The silence was deafening as families of victims filled the gallery. Media representatives prepared their cameras, and Daniel and Sophie sat motionless at the defendant's table, their expensive attorneys flanking them like sentries. Judge Foster's voice cut through the tension. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," responded the jury foreman, a 52-year-old grandfather named Robert Chen, whose own elderly mother had been watching the trial coverage with intense interest. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree against Linda Warren, how do you find the defendants Daniel Warren and Sophie Warren?" "Guilty, Your Honor." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. I felt Patricia's hand squeeze mine as a collective gasp rose from the gallery. Daniel's face went pale, while Sophie closed her eyes and leaned forward as if physically struck. "On the charge of elder abuse and financial exploitation, how do you find the defendants?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the charge of fraud and forgery in connection with financial documents belonging to Linda Warren?" "Guilty, Your Honor." "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder using hired killers across state lines?" "Guilty on all counts, Your Honor." The verdicts kept coming. Guilty on 14 separate charges that would ensure Daniel and Sophie would spend decades behind bars. As Judge Foster read the jury's decisions, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication that was difficult to process. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later, and it was during this proceeding that the full impact of their crimes became clear. FBI agent Maria Rodriguez testified that the investigation triggered by my case had led to arrests in 12 states and prevented an estimated 30 additional murders for hire targeting elderly victims. Mrs. Warren's survival didn't just save her own life, Agent Rodriguez testified. It dismantled a criminal network that had been operating for 7 years and had generated over $2.3 million in illegal profits from families willing to murder their relatives for inheritance money. Judge Foster imposed sentences that reflected the severity and scope of their crimes. Daniel received 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 30 years, while Sophie received 40 years with parole eligibility after 25 years. The difference in their sentences reflected Daniel's role as the primary organizer and his deeper betrayal as my biological son. But the legal victory was only part of my journey toward justice and healing. The financial restitution process revealed the extent of damage Daniel and Sophie had caused to my life and legacy. Court-appointed financial recovery specialist David Martinez spent 3 months tracking down assets and recovering stolen funds. Mrs. Warren, we were able to recover approximately $63,000 in cash and assets from various accounts and luxury purchases, he explained during our meeting. However, the remaining $46,400 was lost to gambling and poor investments and cannot be recovered. The house they had purchased with my stolen money was sold, generating $89,000 after mortgage payments and legal fees. Combined with the recovered assets, I received $152,000 in restitution. Not enough to fully compensate for their theft, but a significant recovery that would help secure my remaining years. More importantly, the media attention and public support had generated opportunities I never could have imagined. Publishers Weekly contacted me about writing a book detailing my experience, offering a $75,000 advance for Surviving Family, A Mother's Fight Against Greed and Murder. The National Institute on Aging invited me to serve as a spokesperson for elder abuse prevention, a role that came with a modest but meaningful annual stipend of $15,000 plus travel expenses to speak at conferences and medical schools. Perhaps most gratifying was the Linda Warren Foundation, established by donations from supporters nationwide. The foundation had raised $127,000 to provide legal assistance for elderly victims of family financial abuse and to train medical professionals in recognizing signs of elder exploitation. Patricia had accepted a position as Director of Patient Advocacy at Cincinnati General Hospital, with a salary increase to $62,000 per year and the responsibility for implementing elder abuse prevention protocols throughout the hospital system. "Linda," Patricia said during one of our regular coffee meetings, "your case has revolutionized how hospitals approach suspicious family behavior. We've already identified and stopped 3 potential cases of family-perpetrated medical abuse since implementing the new protocols." Detective Chen had been promoted to lead the newly created Elder Crimes Unit for Hamilton County, focusing specifically on financial exploitation and abuse of elderly victims. She credited my case with demonstrating the need for specialized law enforcement response to family-based crimes against the elderly. But the most profound impact was on my relationship with my granddaughter Emma, now 9 years old. With Daniel and Sophie in prison, Emma was living with Sophie's parents, who had been horrified to learn about their daughter's crimes and were committed to maintaining Emma's relationship with me. "Grandma Linny," Emma said during one of our weekly visits, "I'm glad you didn't die. Daddy and Mommy did something very bad, but you're still here to teach me how to make cookies." Her innocent words captured the essence of what I had survived and why it mattered. Family isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by love, loyalty, and the commitment to protect rather than harm those who are vulnerable. The financial recovery, the legal victory, and the platform to help other victims were all meaningful outcomes. But the greatest triumph was simpler. I was alive to bake cookies with my granddaughter, to share family stories that would have died with me, and to demonstrate that surviving betrayal can lead to a life with more purpose and meaning than before. Daniel and Sophie had tried to reduce me to a dollar amount, $350,000 in insurance and property value. Instead, their failed murder attempt had transformed me into something immeasurable, a symbol of survival, a voice for the voiceless, and proof that love can triumph over greed when justice and courage combine to protect the vulnerable. As I prepared for the next chapter of my life, I knew that surviving their betrayal was just the beginning of my most important work, ensuring that other families would never experience the horror of relatives who view murder as a financial planning strategy. 1 year after the verdict, I stood in the kitchen of my renovated home, teaching Emma how to make my grandmother's apple pie recipe, the same recipe that had been passed down through 4 generations of Warren women. The afternoon sunlight streamed through windows I had never thought I would see again, illuminating a life that had been transformed by surviving the ultimate betrayal. The house felt different now, not because of the security system or the reinforced locks, but because it had become a sanctuary built on truth rather than a target for those who would exploit love for profit. The $152,000 in recovered funds had allowed me to pay off the fraudulent loans Daniel and Sophie had taken against my property, repair damage they had caused, and even add a small addition that served as my home office for the foundation work. Patricia stopped by every Sunday for dinner, a tradition that had evolved from professional caregiving to genuine friendship. She had become the daughter I had hoped Sophie might be, loyal, protective, and committed to using her experiences to help others. Her work at the hospital had prevented 12 potential cases of elder abuse in the past year, and she was developing training programs for medical professionals nationwide. "Linda," Patricia said, as we watched Emma carefully measure flour for the pie crust, "I got a call from a hospital in Portland yesterday. A nurse there recognized warning signs in a family's behavior because of the protocols we developed after your case. They prevented what could have been another Margaret Collins situation. The ripple effects of my survival continued to expand in ways I never could have anticipated. The book Surviving Family had become a bestseller, generating enough income to fund the Linda Warren Foundation for the next 5 years. More importantly, It had sparked a national conversation about elder abuse that was leading to legislative changes in multiple states. Senator Patricia Williams, no relation to my Patricia, had introduced the Warren Act in Congress, legislation that would require mandatory reporting of suspicious family financial activity involving elderly individuals and would provide federal funding for elder abuse investigation units in every state. The bill had bipartisan support and was expected to pass within the year. "Grandma Linny," Emma said, carefully rolling out the pie dough with intense concentration. "Mrs. Patterson at school said you're famous. Are you really famous?" I smiled, thinking about how to explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes terrible things can lead to important changes. "Emma, I became known to many people because something very bad happened to our family. But sometimes, when bad things happen, we can use them to help other people and make the world a little safer." Emma nodded solemnly. "Like how you help other grandmas and grandpas who have mean families?" "Exactly like that, sweetheart." The foundation work had become my life's most meaningful mission. We had provided legal assistance to 47 elderly victims of family financial abuse, helped recover over $890,000 in stolen assets, and supported prosecution of 19 cases of attempted murder or neglect for financial gain. Each case reminded me of my own narrow escape. There was 72-year-old Margaret Foster in Tennessee, whose grandson had been slowly poisoning her with antifreeze while stealing her Social Security checks. There was 69-year-old Robert Chen in California, whose daughter-in-law had been manipulating his medications to accelerate his death while positioning herself as the primary beneficiary of his $400,000 estate. But we had also celebrated victories. Margaret Foster recovered completely and testified at her grandson's trial, leading to his conviction and a 20-year sentence. Robert Chen's daughter-in-law was arrested before she could complete her plan, and Robert was now living safely with relatives who actually valued his life over his money. Detective Chen, now head of the Elder Crimes Unit, regularly consulted with the Foundation about emerging patterns in family-perpetrated financial abuse. "Linda, we're seeing cases where adult children are using their parents' isolation during the pandemic to accelerate exploitation," she explained during one of our quarterly meetings. "Your Foundation's awareness campaigns are helping families recognize warning signs before situations become critical." The most unexpected development had been my relationship with Emma's maternal grandparents, Harold and Janet Mitchell. They had been devastated to learn about Sophie's crimes and had dedicated themselves to ensuring Emma maintained connections to the loving parts of her family history while understanding the truth about her parents' actions. "Linda," Harold said during one of our family dinners, "we failed to see what Sophie had become, and we're grateful every day that you survived to tell the truth. Emma needs to know that family should protect and cherish each other, not exploit and harm." Emma was thriving despite the trauma of her parents' imprisonment. She was an honor student, played soccer, and had formed strong friendships with children whose families understood her unique situation. Most importantly, she was learning about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family through her relationships with people who had chosen to care for her rather than exploit her. As Emma and I finished preparing the apple pie, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 18 months ago, I had been lying unconscious in a hospital bed while my son and daughter-in-law planned my murder. Today, I was stronger both physically and emotionally than I had been in years, surrounded by people who valued my life and committed to work that would protect other vulnerable families. The financial recovery had been significant. Beyond the restitution, the book sales, and foundation donations, my speaking fees and consulting work had generated more income than I had ever imagined possible. But more importantly, I had discovered a purpose that transcended money, using my survival to ensure other families would never experience the horror of relatives who view murder as inheritance planning. "Grandma Linny," Emma said as we slid the pie into the oven, "when I grow up, I want to help people like you do. That would make me very proud, Emma. But remember, the most important thing is to always value people more than money, and to protect those who need help rather than take advantage of them." As the aroma of apple pie filled the kitchen, I thought about Daniel and Sophie, now serving their sentences in federal prison. They had traded their freedom and their daughter's childhood for money they never even got to enjoy. Their greed had cost them everything: their liberty, their family, their reputations, and any chance of redemption. But their failed murder attempt had given me something invaluable: the knowledge that survival, justice, and purpose can emerge from even the darkest betrayals. I was 67 years old, healthier and more fulfilled than I had been in decades, surrounded by chosen family who valued love over money and committed to work that would protect other vulnerable people from the kind of exploitation I had survived. As I looked around my kitchen, at Emma carefully watching the timer, at Patricia reading medical journals at the dining table, at photos of foundation success stories covering the refrigerator, I realized that Daniel and Sophie's ultimate failure wasn't just their inability to kill me for money. Their greatest failure was their inability to understand that the most valuable inheritance isn't financial. It's the legacy of love, protection, and care that defines true family. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey of survival, justice, and healing. If my story has touched your heart or opened your eyes to the reality of elder abuse, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Most importantly, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Knowing that people around the world are listening gives me strength to continue this important work. Remember, family should protect, not exploit. Love should nurture, not destroy. And survival, when it comes with purpose, can transform even the deepest betrayals into the most meaningful victories. Stay safe, protect your loved ones, and never let anyone convince you that money is more valuable than life itself.